Thank you. Well, just to say that it's great to be here for the day. It was good to be part of the AGM this morning and to hear all of the work that the Family Education Trust is involved in. I've been receiving the bulletins for many years, and actually were very helpful in my own research. I think Norman has done a wonderful job in being able to very clearly pinpoint the very important issues, particularly when it comes to issues like sex education. And so I want to extend my thanks to Norman and to the Family Education Trust just for their ongoing work. So we've heard already this morning a number of issues. Norman raised a number of issues around the introduction of statutory sex and relationship, or relationship and sex education as it will now be called. And so what I present this afternoon, I'll certainly not be talking to you the whole time, because I would love to just facilitate the opportunity for discussion and questions. But I want to just explore with you perhaps some more of the moral questions that we need to be thinking about as this goes forward and develops. We can't help but have noted that in recent months our Western culture has experienced a renewed public crisis in how we are relating to one another sexually. The Me Too campaign has burst open a tide of anger and long-held resentments at how individuals have experienced the sexual responses and behaviours of others. Still on the crest of the movement, it also led some to question what accounts for a Me Too type of behaviour. Journalist and broadcaster Mariella Forstrup, writing last week in the Radio Time, questioned that very thing. She asked whether we are losing our sense of proportion as we throw every act of perceived sexism into the Me Too basket. She's brave for asking the question. And if we dare, this leads us to ask important and fundamental questions of our public narrative around sex. What's the measure by which we judge behaviours to be appropriate or inappropriate? Is there an objective standard by which behaviour amounts to sexual harassment and assault? Or is my subjective judgment sufficient? If I feel sexually violated, does that equate with sexual violation? As Harvey Weinstein's lawyer recently insisted, offensive behaviour does not equate with criminal behaviour. Perhaps not, but where do we start in tackling offensive behaviour, and whose measure of offensive do we apply? This is a public conversation, and one that has significant implications for the moral narrative that's forming the cultural script for the emerging generation. In a BBC report last year, a 24-year-old secondary school teacher told of her shock at the stories she hears from her teenage pupils. She recounts the language the boys use to discuss sex and sexual acts as degrading and showing a lack of understanding of consent and the actual mutual respect required to have meaningful sex. The girls, equally, she continues, are taught not to respect their own bodies and don't comprehend the notion that they may be being used. She concluded, we now have a generation that no longer sees the gravitas of sex. What this recent crisis in sexual morality at least shows us is that in a culture where expressive individualism is the moral norm, rather than achieving sexual freedom, individuals are experiencing disrespect, degrading behaviour, and sexual brokenness. And as both a cause and a response, we have tragically lowered the bar of sexual morality so low that our public conversations revolve around whether a behaviour gets over the legal requirement of consent as set out in the criminal law. So as we come to explore together some of the issues around the introduction of statutory relationships and sexuality education in England, I want to suggest that what this cultural mood has created is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to reignite and to contribute to a public conversation on our understanding of the good when it comes to sexual behaviour. A good that goes beyond the self-scripted morality of individual choice and places relationships back in the centre. For educators, it gives us an opportunity to explore again what behaviours and qualities of character contribute to the good of the individual and the good of society. What is our vision of a relationally and sexually educated young person? What knowledge, what skills, what attitudes and values would you want a 16-year-old to possess? So turning specifically to the changes that are afoot, let me just take a few moments to say something of the background to this government move. So there's been a long campaign to make relationships and sex education, or sex and relationships education as it has been known to date, to become a statutory subject in the curriculum. Indeed, government policy on sex education goes back to 1948. Therefore, the new legislation was not an unexpected policy move. It was the Children and Social Work Act of 2017 which introduced the new legislation and made the subject compulsory. It's a compulsory requirement for secondary schools, including academies, free schools, independent schools, and maintained schools. And primary schools are also required to provide relationships education. And the new requirement for delivery begins in September 2019. As Norman made clear this morning, the government consulted earlier in the year on what should be included in the curriculum, and the Family Education Trust offered a very detailed and thorough response. So we currently await draft regulations and guidance from the Department for Education on the teaching of relationships and sex education and relationships education in primary school. But what in the end was the reason the government gave for making it statutory? This is what the government policy statement said. Given the increasing concern around child sexual abuse and exploitation and the growing risks associated with growing up in a digital world, there is a particularly compelling case to act in relation to pupil safety. While this indeed may be a compelling reason to put RSE onto a statutory footing, it of course reminds us that no policy approach to RSE is neutral, or indeed uncontroversial. Therefore, we need to explore the questions and the complexities that feature in a policy decision to teach RSE. First, a subject that raises fundamental questions over identity, sexuality, and indeed the boundaries between the individual, the state, and the home cannot but raise moral controversy. Indeed, if government is committed to parents remaining the primary educators of their children and the best judge of what's in their child's best interests, which includes the right to withdraw their child, this will need to remain centre stage in any proposals moving forward. But secondly, when it comes to the moral direction of policy, the argument is made that when beneficial consequences are aimed at and recognised harms are avoided, then a government is pursuing a liberal, value-neutral ideal in sex education. So in light, therefore, of the government's defence of RSE, the harms of child sexual abuse and the exploitation and the risks of the digital world are the harms that are to be avoided, and pupil safety is to be pursued. However, this is clearly not a neutral position, for underlying these identified harms are an understanding of welfare. An understanding of welfare both for the young person and for society at large, shaped by a vision of human flourishing. So in exploring the adequacy of our current moral approach to policy formation, I'm going to break down our discussion into the 3 points that we see on the screen. What is the harm that RSE is currently seeking to address? What is the good that RSE is seeking to promote? I will answer these first two questions in order to argue that we have a deficient concept of the good when it comes to RSE, because we've lost an understanding of the intrinsic good of sexual behaviour. In response, we need to help young people to discover the meaning and purpose of their sexual choices. This will lead us then to ask a further supplementary question: what might a renewed vision of the good look like for relationships and sexuality education moving forward. Firstly, let us look at harm that sex education has to date been seeking to address. It's clear that responding to teenage pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections has been a policy driver for SRE to date. In particular, the socio-economic cost of young people's sexual behaviour is a harm that successive governments have sought to address. New Labour, for example, identified teenage pregnancy within the discourse of social exclusion. In launching the Social Exclusion Unit's report on teenage pregnancy in 1999, Tony Blair measured the scale of the problem in terms of the significant costs which resulted. The report said this: teenage mothers are less likely to finish their education, less likely to find a job, and more likely to end up both as single parents and bringing up their children in poverty. The children themselves run a much greater risk of poor health and have much higher chance of becoming teenage mothers themselves. What was distinct about this policy agenda was that it was intended to explicitly move away from moral judgments and to evidence-based practice. But the very definition of the problem or harm that teenage sexual behaviour was trying to tackle was itself a moral judgment. Harm, therefore, of teenage sexual behaviour has largely been defined by a measure of socio-economic cost, and health education and health promotion were to be directed towards reducing that harm. So if teenage pregnancy and STIs were the harm, then policy was to be directed to addressing that harm. However, is teenage pregnancy and STIs too narrow a definition of the harm of young people's sexual behaviour? What if we were to move beyond health outcomes towards a more holistic understanding of a young person's relational and emotional well-being? Might we arrive at a different cost-benefit appraisal of the right policy approach? A particular focus on the provision of confidential sexual health services, including contraception and abortion, have clearly narrowed our understanding of harm. Now, with the increased focus on child sexual abuse and exploitation, we are already seeing an expanse in our understanding of the harm of teenage sexual behaviour. So if that's the harm, what is the good that SRE has been seeking to promote? To date, a liberal understanding of moral education has dominated the moral discourse around SRE. This is a so-called informed choice approach. This approach says that we educate young people towards independence and self-sufficiency, where young people are perceived to make free, autonomous choices through the exercise of their rationality. It presumes that young people have the innate ability to reason morally and to act accordingly. Again, while this is perceived to be a morally neutral approach to education, an approach that nurtures freedom, equality, and rationality, these immoral concepts themselves need to be qualified. For example, in promoting rational decision-making, you cannot encourage young people to reason about the good or think morally when it comes to relationships and sexual behaviour without first providing them with moral resources or starting points from which to do so. As ethicist Stanley Hauerwas states, we do not create moral values, principles, virtues. Rather, they constitute a life for us to appropriate. The very idea that we choose what is valuable undermines our confidence in its worth. In light of this, we cannot ignore the role that culture plays in shaping our desires and thus our practices. We are not as rationally autonomous or sexually autonomous, for that matter, as we might think or indeed wish that we were. To be human is to be an embodied moral agent living within a matrix of relationships. Further, where the emphasis is on the promotion of rational, autonomous decision-making, the state is also not indifferent to the sexual decisions that young people make, as demonstrated in the Safer Sex campaigns and the ready availability of contraception. Yet, at the same time as promoting safer sex messages, any approach that would seem to promote abstinence is seen as prescriptive and exclusive. Of course, within an informed choice approach, there is the option for young people to say no to sex. But any moral guidance as to when and what circumstances it might be morally prudent to say yes and no is deemed an infringement of individual liberty. Yet, if impartiality is the prerequisite, then wear a condom could also arguably be seen as an exclusive and negative message. For such a message excludes those young people that are not or have not been sexually active, and indeed conflicts with the teaching of the Catholic Church. Once again, the underlying vision of the good in RSE, that of producing autonomous decision makers who live according to their own moral code, is a vision of good and human flourishing. This is one that regards young people engaging in sexual activity as a normal and indeed inevitable stage in their development. The moral prerequisite is that the sexual exchange is consensual and ideally pleasurable. Therefore, in light of the explicit and implicit moral judgments being made in policy, it's essential to ask what the truth is that we are telling young people about their sexuality and their sexual choices. The philosopher and ethicist Peter Singer argues that sex raises no special moral issues at all. This is not to say that sex does not give rise to moral questions, but these are not questions that are intrinsic to sexual activity. He presents his argument this way: decisions about sex may involve considerations of honesty, concern for others, prudence, and so on. But there is nothing special about sex in this respect, for the same could be said of decisions about driving a car. He continues, in fact, the moral issues raised by driving a car, both from an environmental and from a safety point of view, are much more serious than those raised by having sex. Thus, sex is morally neutral. The same rules that apply to sexual behaviour equally apply to other behaviours. But does this mean that all sexual acts are morally equivalent? Are there not sexual practices that are inherently right or wrong? No, according to ethicist John Harris. He argues that there's nothing wrong about sex of any kind, as long as the act does not involve violation or exploitation. The teaching of consent therefore becomes the moral imperative in RSE, and if there's any good purpose of sex that can be identified, it's one of securing subjective pleasure. And anybody who's involved in sex education discussions will note that the inclusion of pleasure within sex education discourse has increased. Therefore, our public sexual ethic is increasingly being shaped by an understanding of sexual morality which argues that anything sexually goes as long as it's in private, but between consenting partners, and harms no one else. And it comes down to the criminal law to define which behaviours are deemed inappropriate and wrong. This is both incoherent and inadequate for shaping a public sexual ethic and understanding the meaning and purpose of sex. As the Me Too campaign has brought to our public awareness, sexual violation is a particular type of violation because sexual activity is a particular type of activity that deserves a particular type of respect. If young people have no understanding of the good of sexual behaviour, they are vulnerable and ill-equipped to exercise their moral agency and navigate the cultural terrain. Ultimately, the problem with our current understanding of human sexuality and morality is that it's telling us a story that is inconsistent with who we were made to be and what we were made for. The sociologist Christian Smith, writing on emerging adults in the United States, notes, emerging adults can jump into intimate relationships assuming that sex is just another consumer item, recreational thrill, or lifestyle commodity. But many of them soon discover the hard way that sex is much more profound and precious than that. As the 24-year-old secondary school teacher noted, we've lost the gravitas of sex. So what might a renewed vision of the good look like for relationships and sexuality education moving forward? I apologise if I get the relationships and sex and sexuality. In Northern Ireland we call it relationships and sexuality education, but it's essentially the same subject. The challenge in moving forward with developing RSE policy and guidance and school curriculum is how we help young people to discover meaning and purpose in their sexual choices. Where culture has impoverished our understanding of the intrinsic good of sexual behaviour, we need to help young people to critically examine the moral messages that are presented to them and encourage them to question the meaning and purpose of their choices, so that they exercise their moral agency and decide, not just slide, into relationships. For example, where research still evidences that young people want to get married, we need to help them to explore the idea that this is because we were designed for emotional intimacy and fidelity. In doing so, we need to tell young people a better story about their sexuality. Glyn Harrison, in his book, A Better Story, God, Sex and Human Flourishing, says that as Christians, we don't need to outtell the narrative of culture, we need to tell a better one. We need to tell young people that they are more than their sexual instincts, and that their sexual instinct points to something beyond themselves, that they were created for a relationship. Rather than reducing our moral script to one of consent, we need to enrich our moral understanding of the context of sexual relationships. Otherwise, we are in effect socializing and educating our young people to sleep with strangers. In a sex-saturated culture, we need to help young people to consider the relational context and the reason for saying no to sex, as well as the ideal context in which to say yes. We also need to give them a reason that's not limited to the dangers of unplanned pregnancy or catching an STI, but points to the good of sexual behaviour. A renewed vision of good in RSE will teach young people social skills to build healthy and worthwhile relationships, including relationship skills that centre around commitment, communication, and conflict resolution. It will explore the values that are important and the virtues that constitute good character and contribute to the flourishing of the individual and the community. Building character is not just about moral knowledge, but it's how our desires are shaped by a vision of the good that influences our behaviour. Knowing the good, desiring the good, and doing the good. Our passions, instincts, and emotions are not suppressed or neutralised, but are instead ordered towards a vision of the moral good, towards an understanding of sexual virtue. Within a Christian vision of character, the virtue of love stands at the forefront of this narrative, and all other virtues are understood and perfected through its exercise. While there is often a normative disjuncture between sex and love in modern culture, a Christian understanding of sex signifies a permanent and exclusive type of relationship as exemplified in marriage. Casual sex, as Lewis Smedes notes, is a contradiction in terms within the Christian narrative. Through the exploration of the multifaceted nature of love as understood within the Christian tradition, the narrative of RSE can be enriched. As Tim and Kathy Keller note in their book on the meaning of marriage, to be loved but not known is comforting but superficial. To be known but not loved is our greatest fear. But to be fully known and truly loved is, well, a lot like being loved by God. It is what we need more than anything. Young people need to be presented with a moral vision for their sexual lives that is not derived from experience or instinct. Instead, they need to be presented with a more coherent vision of what it is to be truly human. In this way, choices become inspired and not merely informed. Thank you, and I'm very happy to take any questions.